We're just admitting a few more participants. They're coming in a little at a time. I can see the numbers increasing. So we'll be able to start very shortly when the numbers start to settle. Yes, we may get a few more people, but I think we can probably start. So welcome to this evening's webinar on 17th century revival in stained glass. My name is Stephen Chater, and I am your moderator for this evening. And I'll just give you an indication of the running order. We'll start with the welcome. Unfortunately, although on the slide it mentions that the welcome will be from the Master Glazier, we are without the Master Glazier for technical reasons. There will be a talk by Dr. Mark Kirby, which is the highlight of the evening. There will then be some questions and answers, and we'll finish with some closing remarks. Now, there are various ways in which you as participants can engage with the process. We have a number of polls, a couple of questions that will be put to you, and you can put in your answers. There is then the opportunity to ask some questions of our speaker, Dr. Kirby. And even if you cannot think of a question yourself, you can have a look at the Q&A function, which will be either at the bottom or top or the side of your screen, along with your other icons. You can see what questions other people have put in, and you can vote for your favorite question. But please think about a question yourself, which we can put to Dr. Kirby at the end. We'll have about 10 minutes to do that. And if that is not exciting enough, there is also another facility among the icons, which is the chat facility, where you can put in comments so that we know that Dr. Kirby is attached to Lincoln College, Oxford, and the college chapel will feature heavily in his talk. So if you've been to Lincoln College Chapel, or indeed any other chapel in Oxford or Cambridge that has 17th century glass, then perhaps you might like to put that in the chat. But if you have a question, put that in the Q&A function, not the chat function. So we now move to the introduction of the first poll, which is your location. We'd like to know where you are listening to this webinar from. And we'll ask you whether you are in the UK or in other parts of the world. So there'll be a few seconds for you to answer this poll. So perhaps if we can launch that poll and allow you to answer, you've got a choice, which you see on the screen before you. So I'm going to count down on the availability of this poll. You have 5 seconds remaining. 4, 3, 2, 1. Closing the poll now. And I hope that I will see the result before me. And I see that an overwhelming majority, 96% of participants are in the UK. But interestingly, we have 4% of participants in the EU. So thank you very much for that. We then have a second poll, which is your interest in this webinar, whether you are already a member of the Glaziers company or interested in joining. So can we launch that second poll? Here you are, here are your options. I'll now count down on voting. You have 5 seconds left. 4, 3, 2, 1. Closing the poll. And I hope that we will get an interesting result. We've got 68% of participants who are members of the Glaziers company, 18% who are not, and excitingly for us, 14% who are not members of the company but might be interested in joining. So thank you very much for that second poll. We then have a poll where we're going to ask you a question, and you're not expected to know the answer to this. And if you don't know the answer, have a guess, and we'll see what people have guessed before the talk. And then after the talk, we'll get Dr. Kirby to tell us what the real answer is. So can we launch this next poll? In which region did William Dowsing carry out his iconoclastic campaign of smashing stained glass in 1643 to 4? You have 4 options, and you can choose in 5 seconds, 4 seconds, 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1, and closing the poll. And we have an interesting spread of responses. 32% of people went for the West Country, 8% for the home counties, 48% for East Anglia, and 12% for the Midlands. So we'll keep you in suspense until a little later in the webinar, but I think it falls now to me to introduce Dr. Kirby, who is sitting in Lincoln College, ready to give us his talk. As you'll see from the screen, Dr. Kirby is the Child Shuffrey Research Fellow in Architectural History at Lincoln College, Oxford. So I think I'll just hand over to Dr. Kirby now. There'll be a little bit of shuffling in the slides, which is just happening on the screen now. And I shall stop talking and I shall hand over to Dr. Kirby, who is just starting to share his screen, and you'll be able to see his splendid slides.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed for the introduction. You're welcome. And indeed the invitation to speak to your members and others this evening. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about this particular period in stained glass. And I hope that if it's not a period that people are currently familiar with, that by the end of the next half hour or so, you will feel that there is interest and quality to be explored in early 17th century stained glass. Now, the revival of stained glass in the early 17th century is easily overlooked. It was very short, barely 30 years. And even when you take into account all the glass that has been lost, it did not produce a large output. Consequently, it tends to be overshadowed by the larger and more extant collection of medieval glass and Victorian Gothic revival glass. But it is fascinating nonetheless, not least because in some senses it was a revival which should never have taken place. By that I mean that the official doctrine of the Church of England was technically still one of hostility to religious imagery. Now, this evening, we don't have time to look at how theological attitudes changed, but change they did. And by the turn of the 17th century, there was the beginnings of a readiness for commissioning new figurative stained glass. Given the doctrinal background and what we all know about Puritan opinions of religious imagery, it comes as no surprise, therefore, that when the revival did start, it did so in a tentative way and in the context of elite private chapels. The first we can be confident about was when Robert Cecil, Earl of Salisbury, commissioned windows for his private chapel at Hatfield House in 1609 to 10. This was made by two prominent glass painters, Richard Butler and the French glazier Louis Dolphin, which I assume is an anglicised version of Louis Dauphin. And he then went on to install more glass at his London mansion, Salisbury House, in 1611 to 12, all of which was done by Butler. The Hatfield window establishes two of the critical features of the first phase of this revival. First is its setting in a private chapel, away from the sight of the uneducated masses. Any lingering concerns about images leading to idolatry can be overcome in the household of a committed Protestant dynasty like the Cecils. And secondly, the images set up there are an exercise in biblical typology. Now, this is a term I will come back to later on and spend a little bit of time to define, because it's an important feature of glass in this period. And from a stylistic and technical point of view, the Hatfield window very definitely picks up from the closing decades of stained glass before the Reformation brought it to an end. The palette is one of bright primary colours, and the scenes are dramatic and full of action. This is also what French and Dutch stained glass was like in the early to mid 16th century. And the Hatfield window is closer in spirit to those continental Renaissance windows than to medieval English Gothic ones. Other aristocratic and episcopal commissions followed in a variety of private or semi-private chapels, such as in almshouses. Some of these survive, such as at Trinity Hospital, Greenwich. This was made for Henry Howard, Earl of Northampton, in around 1614 and painted by Louis Dolphin. And it's probably the first depiction in stained glass of the crucifixion since the Reformation, though I'm always interested to be proved wrong. Howard repeatedly denied that he was a Catholic, though he certainly was on his deathbed, as his will testified. He died actually very shortly after this window was installed in the chapel. And you can see it's full of very explicitly Catholic themes, most noticeably, of course, the crucifixion itself. Another private commission survives from Easton Lodge, Essex. This was in the family chapel of the mansion of the Maynard family and was made in around 1621. This is one of a set of three arranged in this sort of fashion now, and it's been rearranged and put into the nearby parish church of St Mary's in Little Easton. It's notable for the very high quality of its glass painting, all the more striking given how little experience the glazier, Baptist Sutton, would have had before. Not only was he young, probably in his early 20s, but his only known previous work was heraldic glass. From an artistic point of view, my personal view is that the Eastern windows are the finest to survive from this period. Do visit them if you can. Sutton also made two windows for the Calvinist Archbishop of Canterbury, and yes, I did say Calvinist in the context of stained glass, George Abbott, at around the same time for the chapel at Abbott's Trinity Hospital in Guildford. In London, a small number of parish churches appear to have had an incumbent churchwardens, wealthy benefactors, and pliant parishioners the combination of which was necessary to take new glass into the more public realm of parish churches. All the London parishes which did install new figurative glass, of which we know of 14 between 1613 and 1640, were parishes with ceremonialist leanings, and ones which would not surprise us for embracing the new fashion for stained and painted glass. There was also a significant set of new windows made for St. Paul's Cathedral, depicting episodes from the life of St. Paul, and probably set up in the north choir aisle, though we don't know for certain. Unsurprisingly, given the political events of the following decades, none of those in parish churches in the city proper survived through the Civil War and interregnum, except for one example of non-figurative glass in a rose window formation at St. Catherine Cree. Not only did it survive the Civil War and interregnum, but also survived the Great Fire of London. So it's quite a precious piece of glass. Some 17th century glass does survive in parish churches outside London, and in all cases it is associated with the patronage of the local gentry or aristocratic family in one way or another. One such family was the St. John family, who had a liking for memorializing themselves. Sir John St. John installed this window at St. Mary Lydiard Tregose in Wiltshire in around 1628. And it's a play on his personal and family name, with St. John the Baptist and St. John the Apostle flanking the St. John family tree, and it's literally represented as being a tree. And he also filled the east window of St. Mary's Battersea with yet more family armorials in 1631. We see here for the first time in this discussion the name of Abraham Van Linge, and his is a name that we will come back to. In another example, Viscount Scudamore installed two almost identical sets of designs of glass, first at the parish church in Salac in 1630, and then at Dore Abbey in 1632 to 34. Both of these are in Herefordshire. Robert Walker has studied these windows, and he argues that they are probably painted by Scudamore himself. And I think if you look at the artistry, perhaps I would best describe it as naive and enthusiastic, but it is definitely not great artistry. While not in a parish church context, there was a major exercise in what we might think of as being safe Protestant glass, which was carried out in the newly built chapel of Lincoln's Inn, which was consecrated in 1623. Lincoln's Inn was the most politically radical of the Inns of Court, and it acquired a reputation as its most Puritan one as well. And yet, despite that, here we see large-scale figurative depictions of prophets and apostles. An indication of the Puritan and radical character of the inn comes in 1641, when, during the rapidly deteriorating political atmosphere in the run-up to the Civil War, when the House of Commons wanted to protest against the King's encroachment on their privileges, one of the ways that they signalled their displeasure was to move their communion service from St. Margaret's, Westminster, which was controlled by the Dean of Westminster Abbey, to Lincoln's Inn Chapel. So if this interior, with its abundant and new stained glass, could be used in this way as a place of protest, then clearly a shift in attitudes was taking place across the whole of society. And the spread of new glass elsewhere in the early 17th century begins to become easier to understand. What seems to have made the Lincoln's Inn windows safe in a Protestant city and inn is in part the choice of subject matter, prophets and apostles, and in part the manner of their depiction. Old Testament prophets had never been the subject of widespread idolatry before the Reformation anyway. And the way in which they and the apostles are depicted here makes no emotional demands on the viewer. There are no martyrdoms, no adorations, no saintly miracles, and most importantly, no crucifixion scene, which might disturb the godly sensibilities of the benchers of the inn. But it was in Oxford that the most sustained and concentrated campaign of new stained and painted glass took place. Early Stuart Oxford saw a wealth of new chapel glazing being installed at a time when the university was growing in size, leading to entire new college buildings being built along with new chapels. Recalling that the colleges were still in large part seminaries for the training of clergy of the Church of England, the new chapels were an important feature of the university in this period. The same may be said in Cambridge, but there the impact of stained glass was much smaller. In Oxford, when Charles I visited in 1636, one of the Londoners accompanying the royal party, George Garrard, who was the chaplain to the Earl of Northumberland, noted that the quality of the new glass in Oxford, which he noticed was mostly by Dutchmen, was far superior to the new windows recently installed at St Paul's Cathedral and London parish churches, mostly by Englishmen. Garrard spent what seemed to be a pleasant couple of days church crawling, and he commented that the churches or chapels of all the colleges are much beautified, extraordinary cost bestowed on them. Scarce any cathedral churches, not Windsor or Canterbury, nay, not Paul's Choir exceeds them. Most of them new glazed, rich glass for figures and painting I have not seen. The two earliest examples of new glass in Oxford were the new foundation of Wadham College, which you see here, with the first part of its glass being made by Robert Rudland. Then Bernard Van Linge and probably Lewis Dolphin also contributed windows. And also at Lincoln College, all of whose glass was by Bernard Van Linge's brother Abraham. In both of these chapels, the north and south windows used the same theme as at Lincoln's Inn in London, with prophets on the north side and apostles on the south. As artistic endeavours, these are not of the greatest quality, but they are beginning to show greater signs of technique and artistic ability on the part of the glass painters. At Wadham, the foundress, Dorothy Wadham, who herself was a Roman Catholic, was clearly pragmatic in her choice of themes for the windows, and she instructed the head of the college that it may make a little show for what purpose that place was appointed. It's the briefest possible rationalization of the windows, but for all its brevity, it does have a flavour of identifying that stained glass can make a positive contribution to a Protestant place of worship. More artistically successful and more theologically sophisticated were the east windows in both these two chapels, Wadham and Lincoln. And many of the windows which Abraham Van Linge went on to make at 4 other colleges, Queen's, Christ Church, Balliol and University College, between 1633 and 42. Here, the colleges or their benefactors commissioned typological windows, that term again, reflecting their continued sense of themselves as seminaries for the education of Orthodox Protestant theologians and clergy. So, what is typology? Typology is the primary way in which the Old Testament is read in the light of the New, and its origin as a means to interpret the Bible is found in the New Testament itself. Jesus, the Gospel writers, St. Paul and St. Peter all identify examples of Old Testament events, people, or institutions which prefigure, have parallels in, or are fulfilled by New Testament events, primarily in relation to episodes in the life of Christ. Typology is not about prediction, but about promise in the Old Testament and fulfillment in the New. The Old Testament event is called the type, and the New Testament one, the antitype. It's a form of theological thinking that goes back to the earliest days of the church, and you can also find examples of it in medieval stained glass still surviving, such as at Canterbury Cathedral and York Minster. One of the reasons for its adoption, which is relevant for our look at stained glass this evening, is the use that Jesus himself is recorded as making in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke of typology. At one point, when he is asked for a sign by the Pharisees, Jesus replied, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." And that brings us to what became the most commonly used example of typology in stained glass in this period. And it appears 5 times in Oxford chapels just in that one very short period of time. This example comes from the east window in Lincoln College Chapel. Here we see Jonah sort of climbing out of the mouth of the great fish, looking slightly surprised, but really no less worse for his experience. That is set in the lower register of the window, and then the panel that you see on the right, you need to imagine that being immediately above it in the upper register, showing the resurrection, Christ rising from the tomb in the panel above. In each of the typological panels in this window, there is also a scriptural text underneath to underscore the point that these images are acceptable for Protestant use, as they're derived directly from the Bible itself. And this gives us one of 2 forms of the basic structure of typological windows. We saw the other form at Hatfield House, where only the Old Testament scene is used. And the expectation is that the biblically well-read viewer is expected to understand the New Testament connection in his or her mind. In a way, this is what the whole of the east window in Lincoln College Chapel is about. From bottom left, the creation and fall, to top right, Christ's ascension into heaven, the window sets out the whole biblical salvation story and presents the whole of the Bible in that light. Note also, from an artistic point of view, the way in which the leading figure in each of the Old Testament panels in that bottom register is either looking upwards or pointing upwards to the New Testament panels above, as if to say, this is the event that we are experiencing at the moment, and it is a pointer to that episode from the life of Christ in the lights above. And note also how in the Ascension panel, top right, Jesus ascends from earth and is heading to heaven in the tracery lights above. To quote John chapter 14, verse 3, "to prepare a place for you." And here in the tracery lights, we see an architectural depiction of the many mansions of heaven, to use the King James Version wording. Grand and with long receding spacious halls, and importantly shown empty because they're waiting for our arrival. It is this, together with its typological content and the use of biblical inscriptions, which makes this a particularly effective, safe Protestant window for a college with a reputation for being theologically reformed conformists in the Elizabethan and Jacobean mould. They were, if you like, moderate Calvinists and not Puritans, and at Lincoln, certainly not Laudians. Nearly all of the rest of the new Oxford College Chapel windows also included typological references in their schemes in this way. Abraham Van Linge's style of composition and painting also changed and improved over time. He moved away from the large standing figures we saw at Lincoln's Inn and Lincoln College to more complex schemes in which what contemporaries called histories span 2 or 3 lights of a window. At Queen's and Balliol, these have been chopped about since Van Linge made them and refitted for new chapels that were built later on. But you still get an idea of the older form of presentation. Here we have two panels in the windows at Queen's College. On the left-hand side, you see the Annunciation with these greens and turquoises, which is very characteristic of the enamel painting work that Van Linge used. And on the right-hand side, we see the Last Supper on the left part of that window, and a very small sliver of what previously would have been a much wider window depicting the crucifixion, but now cut up and rearranged in order to fit into the different shape of window in the new chapel. Similar sorts of alterations went on at Balliol College as well. And here we have the example of the sickness and recovery of King Hezekiah. I think Van Linge had a particular liking for depicting fabrics. It comes out very strongly here in the canopy over the king's bed, the blue bed cover, which is sort of depicted as some sort of a damask fabric, and the green covering over the table at the side. It's something that Van Linge seemed to be very much drawn to. And in the right-hand window, in the upper part of the left light, you see what became another characteristic feature of his work, which is a depiction of urban settings, cities often depicted as being on the side of a hill or a mountain, and with characteristic blue roofs. At Christchurch, Van Linge made 20 windows, probably in the process displacing quite a lot of medieval glass. Only two of these survive. One is a rather poor standing figure of Bishop King, who was the last abbot of Osney before the Reformation and the first bishop of Oxford. And another is a very fine depiction of Jonah sitting underneath his tree outside the city of Nineveh, waiting for its destruction. Both of these windows were removed by their donors and stored away at an unknown period, but presumably sensing that the political atmosphere was changing and that the windows would be under threat. But all of the other 18 were taken out, laid on the ground of the main quad, Tom Quad, and they were stamped upon by a particularly zealous Puritan called Henry Wilkinson, who was completely determined that they would not be able to be recovered and returned at any future date. At University College, Abraham Van Linge painted his last and probably best work. Here, he finished his windows just as the country was slipping into chaos. Van Linge finished the north and south windows and then left the country in 1642. And the windows were not, in fact, installed until after the restoration of the monarchy. By the time of the outbreak of the Civil War, the chapel itself at University College was not yet completed, and it remained unroofed throughout the whole of the interregnum. This is a wonderful scheme. This just gives some idea of the variety of themes and styles that Van Linge used here. 3 windows in what was originally the antechapel urged the arriving worshipper to put aside the preoccupations of daily life before entering for worship. Here on the left, for example, we see Jesus in the house of Mary and Martha. Martha, holding her ladle, gestures with annoyance to Mary, who kneels at Jesus' feet. Inside the chapel proper is a series of Old Testament types, such as the one here, the sacrifice of Isaac, where the angel intervenes and provides a better sacrifice. By contrast, if we look at the undoubtedly Laudian east window at Peterhouse, Cambridge, installed in 1638, we see a very fine example of Laudian art. This is quite an old photograph. I took this about 10, 12 years ago, and since then the window has been thoroughly cleaned and restored, and it's now much, much brighter than that and really looks quite glorious. The scene depicted here is taken from an engraving of a devotional piece painted by Rubens, painted for the Franciscan church in Antwerp in 1623. It's a single crucifixion scene crossing all 5 lights, and standing immediately over the communion table below makes a powerful theological Eucharistic point. It's no surprise that the college, sensing the way that the wind was blowing, took down all of the chapel's windows and hid them before the parliamentary iconoclast William Dowsing, of whom we heard earlier, came visiting in 1643. Dowsing's men found and destroyed most of the north and south windows. Only one of those lights remains. But thankfully, they failed to find this east window, and it was eventually put back in place after the restoration. Returning finally to Oxford once more, Van Linge on one occasion actually lost a contract to make a series of huge windows in the antechapel at Magdalen College. In that case, a London agent called Thomas Langton campaigned against him and told the fellows of Magdalen that this Dutch is it's an extraordinarily illiterate letter, but I'll read it as it says. This Dutch is sly fellow and strong-headed, and must have a rough muzzle, or else there is no doing with him. And he complained that he was dreadfully overrated and basically charged too much. The commission went instead to Richard Greenbury, who made a set of windows in grisaille depicting saints. It's of a style unlike anything else which had preceded it that century. And the centre window was entirely different, a dramatic Last Judgment, very much pointing the way forward to the very few stained glass windows we see in the 18th century. The window as we see it today was heavily restored, and I put restored in inverted commas, in 1794 by Francis Edgington. And he gave it this sepia tint. Edgington probably changed Greenbury's design in a number of respects, but the basic structure of the outline is still like Greenbury's, which was in turn based on a late 16th century engraving. Greenbury's window was probably more fluid and expressive than the rather static saints in the other windows. But I'm not sure that it was as fluid as this restoration or recreation by Edgington. It's quite possible that your former master, Suzanne Phillips Galloway, who is an expert on Greenbury, is attending this webinar this evening, and she would be far better placed to give you a view on that than I am. Greenbury began to work at Magdalen in 1637, and his last window was installed in 1640, making it one of, if not the, last stained glass window to be installed before the Civil War. Back in 1627, John Donne, poet and Dean of St. Paul's, preached at St. Paul's Cross, elaborating on the theme that England had matured out of the risk of idolatry, and he talked in particular about stained glass windows. And this is true, he said, that where there is frequent preaching, there is no necessity of pictures. But will not every man add this, that if the true use of pictures be preached unto them, there is no danger of an abuse? And so, as remembrances of that which hath been taught in the pulpit, they may be retained. And since by being taught the right use of these pictures in our preaching, no man amongst us is any more inclined or endangered to worship a picture in a wall or a window of the church than if he saw it in a gallery. They may be retained here, as they are in the greatest part of the Reformed Church. Donne finished his observation with the final words, and in all that, that is properly Protestant. Sadly, others did not agree. The Civil War brought huge destruction to churches and stained glass. Parliamentary officials like William Dowsing and Sir Robert Harley were commissioned to cleanse churches and chapels of all, quote, monuments of superstition or idolatry. it is remarkable that as much survives as it does. What we do have, we should treasure. Thank you.
Mark, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. I think we have time for a couple of questions. And I think the first one that I have for you is, why do you think it is that some 17th century glass was destroyed during the civil wars and some not, even in the same town or city?
Yes, it's a very good question. There was certainly a very inconsistent pattern of iconoclasm wherever it happened to be found. And it seemed to depend on multiple sets of circumstances. In and around London, there was almost total destruction, other than at Lincoln's Inn, which is itself quite an interesting observation, being a radical and Puritan inn of court. It's quite strange. I recall that at the trial of Archbishop William Laud, one of the accusations that was put to him was that he put up popish stained glass windows in his chapel at Lambeth Palace. And part of his defense was to say to the very man prosecuting him, William Prynne, but you did the same at Lincoln's Inn. So he was aware at that time that there were distinct inconsistencies. The other great inconsistencies in Cambridge, where William Dowsing went on his sort of voyage of destruction, and yet did not touch the stained glass in King's College Chapel, which is there to this day, and no one has an adequate explanation for how that happened. When it comes to Oxford, I think there's a number of other circumstances. First of all, when the city surrendered to Sir Thomas Fairfax, the parliamentary general, Fairfax granted very lenient terms of surrender to the city and to the university, and he ordered that the colleges would not be attacked or damaged in any way. And as time went on, when windows did start to be attacked, it seems that the ones that were targeted were in colleges which had a particularly strong royalist reputation. If you were a college, as Lincoln was, with a Calvinist reputation and one that had actually been criticised by royalists earlier on for not being sufficiently supportive of the king, you were less likely to come under attack. And I think that's possibly one of the reasons why the windows in Lincoln's chapel were not attacked. There may have been cases of faces being painted over in order to avoid the most, what Puritans would regard as the most egregious examples of potential idolatry. Not just in Oxford chapels, but I think that's probably the case at St Mary's Fairford in Gloucestershire. It's thought that maybe the faces were painted over there as well. So there's a number of reasons, but there are certainly inconsistencies and unanswered questions, especially about Dowsing and King's College Chapel. I find that very, very extraordinary.
Thank you. It's interesting what you were saying about Fairfax, because I think I recall that after the Battle of Marston Moor, and the parliamentary army was moving on to sack the city of York, it was Fairfax who said right, specifically, do not attack the windows. And that's why we have so much medieval glass surviving in York. So perhaps he's someone that we should be thankful to.
I think so.
Was one other question that's just come in, which is, was the 17th century re-emergence in stately homes only within high church or Anglo-Catholic families, or was it adopted by more Lutheran, fully Protestant families too? And I think you have already alluded to this with the Cecils at Hatfield, but would you like to expand on that?
There is a slight possibility that there was what you might call a Cecil circle, because there were two other household chapels which had stained glass put in at roughly the same time, who had connections to the Cecil family. In fact, the one at Eastern Lodge, the Maynard family there had been, one of the Maynards had been, I think, secretary to Lord Burleigh. So there's some sort of familial friendship relationship there. In the case of the Maynards, they were out and out Laudians. The Cecils, though committed Protestants, it's quite difficult to know where on the theological spectrum they stood. But I think for the household chapels, it's mostly you will find those in Laudian households more than any other type of theological position.
Thank you. You mentioned that some commentators in the early days, the sort of the 1610s, the 1620s, were saying that the glass made by Flemish artists was superior to that of English artists. And I just wonder, given that there was no really market for pictorial glass in England between about 1540 and 1610, how did native English artists even learn how to do pictorial glass? Did they train on the continent, or did they learn from Flemish artists who came to this country?
That's a very interesting question about whether some of them might have trained on the continent. I don't know what the answer to that is, but it definitely sounds an interesting path to explore. In a way, the Flemish takeover, so to speak, of English stained glass goes back quite a long way further. Henry VII and Henry VIII both relied primarily on Dutch and Flemish glass painters for their stained glass commissions, and allowed foreign glaziers to set up their studios and workshops in Southwark, where they could be protected outside of the guild regulations that applied within the City of London. So that aspect goes back a long ways earlier, by more than a century. And for example, St. Mary's Fairford, which I mentioned a moment ago, that is most likely to be by Flemish glaziers, thought to be, I think, Gallion Hone, who was the King's glazier and who did a lot of the work at King's College Chapel as well. So English glaziers were probably, well, they definitely felt themselves being pushed out. They repeatedly tried to take legal action against the foreign glaziers in Southwark, even to the point of kidnapping them from time to time, bringing them over London Bridge in order to put them on trial. I think at one point Henry VII had to intervene in order to sort of liberate his own glazier who was being prosecuted in that way. But yes, you're right. It meant that English glaziers had to put up with much less exciting work, less lucrative work, primarily in heraldic glass. And yes, there is this sort of very interesting question as to how someone like Baptist Sutton developed his skills so well without apparently having had any commercial opportunity to do so. Was he simply practicing in the background? Was he making windows of his own just in order to enhance his skills. We don't know, but there must have been something going on for him to be able to produce windows of the quality that he did so very quickly once figurative glass starts to spread again.
Excellent. I think we've got time for one very quick question, which is that you covered a lot of colleges in Oxford that have got surviving 17th century glass. As I understand it, there are not so many in Cambridge. Is that because there wasn't as much that was commissioned in Cambridge, or because more was destroyed in Cambridge?
I didn't think there was a huge amount that was commissioned in the first place. Peterhouse was very much in the lead, and I think there was a fair amount of new glass that was commissioned for St Mary's, the university church there. That was commissioned by John Cousin, who was the master of Peterhouse, who was involved in the commission of the glass in the Peterhouse chapel. He was also vice chancellor of the university, and it was in that capacity that he commissioned the glass for the university church. So that all went. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any other examples of glass in Cambridge College chapels. There was a fair amount of medieval glass that was subsequently destroyed when Dowsing came visiting. I don't think there was that much new glass. It's not an area I've examined in any great depth, so I'm not certain, I'm afraid.
No, that's fine. Well, thank you very much. I think that's we've run out of time on questions and answers, but I think we can now move on to the exciting poll that we had about William Dowsing. Are we able to
I've sort of given the game away.
to reveal the answer? Is the answer about to appear on the screen? I think
the answer, sorry to button here. The answer was a few slides back, I think, but sorry, that's going. Oops.
That was it.
There we go. There's the
there
answer.
It is, and there is the answer. Yes, there was a sort of trigger alert from Mark mentioning Cambridge, so that the answer was East Anglia. And William Dowsing had the nickname of variously Basher or Smasher Dowsing as a result. So I'd like to express
you can tell from his portrait that he was a laugh a minute.
What was that, Mark?
You can tell from his portraits that he was a laugh a minute.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, and I'll just hand over to the learned clerk to express thanks on behalf of the company.
Yes, so my name is Liz Wicksteed. I am the clerk of the company, and I must say I'm very glad that that tradition or that custom of dragging glaziers over London Bridge and putting them on trial in the city has stopped, because the Glaziers Company is now based in Southwark, and I don't like the thought of us having to keep rushing to the artist members' defence every time a police officer walked past our building. Mark, thank you very much indeed for that talk, which was absolutely fascinating. A number of us came on a visit to Oxford in the spring, which included a talk by you in Lincoln College Chapel, and it was a real privilege to see that window in real life and how spectacular it was, and then to hear more about it and see some of the detail in close-up this evening has been a real treat. And it's so interesting to learn how much the Oxford colleges contributed to the development of stained glass in this country. So thank you very much indeed. Anyone who would like to learn more about it still will be very pleased to know that Mark has a book coming out we have to wait until 2027, which is the 600th anniversary of Lincoln College being founded, but there will be enormous amounts of erudition and fascinating facts and tidbits in that book. So something to look forward to. It's just time to mention briefly that the Glaziers Company has a number of events coming up soon, both for the benefit of our members and for the benefit of other people out there. We have the installation dinner is the next big thing at the end of November, where the next master glazier is in fact a true master of the art of making and painting stained glass, John Renchen's MBE. And during his year as master, he will be holding a series of workshops for members of the company and for others, if space allows, where you can go along and spend a weekend really getting to grips with the craft and taking home a piece of glass that you have made yourself. And the first of those are in January. There's a number of other events going on, as you can see, and a great deal more that aren't shown on that slide. So if anybody wants to see more about any of the things that have been talked about, then there's a link there that we can send round to how to go about visiting Lincoln. And also you can have a look on YouTube and see more about Lincoln College Chapel there. Anyone interested in possible membership, like those people who voted that they might be at the beginning of the evening? Here is the link to where to find us on our website at Glaziers Company, and we are always very welcoming of new members and have a reputation within the livery world of being a friendly company. So do take note of that. And meanwhile, you can follow us on social media at the events that are shown at the addresses that are shown in this slide here. So thank you very much indeed, everybody. Stephen, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Liz, and I hope you've all enjoyed this webinar as much as I have. Thank you very much for attending. That's now the end of the webinar. I'm very, very grateful to Dr. Kirby for his excellent talk, and I'd just like to say good night to everybody. Goodbye.